Beit este.
Okay. Take your time, Chalo.
Right. Good. So todo. Bum. Again, Edzigi. All right. Okay. All right. Hafade todos hamzu gweno hudzung estigi un otron episode Fanatsu. Gwawi host Midzu Tatlu. Once again, I am your host for the Fanatsu podcast. And we're welcoming back for this episode of Fanatsu, a guest that we haven't had on for a few years now, but we have strategically invited him back. And again, pun night, that was a strategically placed pun right there. We are bringing back Rick Arriola Perez, who writes commentary on strategic affairs in the Marianas in our region. We last had him on Fanachu a few years ago about this topic. And I'm excited to bring him back because things are heating up. It always seems like things are heating up in our region when you are the tip of America's spear, when you what's it called, live in a place that America loves to call their where the US military loves to call their playground, then you need to be thinking about you need to be thinking about the strategic affairs of the US military because what's it called? Because those those interests, whether you like it or not, those interests end up becoming yours. What the United States is investing in you, what they are thinking about you, that becomes your reality and that becomes your destiny. And so, Sidzus Masi Rick for joining for this episode of Fanatsu.
I'll Moss, Michael. Thank you very much, Dr. Devakwa, for having me on. It's been a long time.
Hungen. And so we've got a lot of things that we can talk about today, but for those people who aren't paying attention, for those people who are too busy let me think. What news is out there? They're not paying attention to sort of what's going on with the US military buildup. Maybe they're not paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East. Maybe they don't know what's going on with Red Hill fuel leaks or anything like that. They don't know what's going on in the South China Sea or in Taiwan. Maybe they've got 7 SACMACs that they've got to pay for. Who knows what's going on in their lives, but they're not paying attention to these sorts of issues. Give us a rundown, sort of where things at in our region.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Devakwa. I think the Pacific Basin and Asia is probably one of the most dynamic and ever-changing and ever-evolving areas of the globe. Um, Certainly, our island chain, the Marianas and Guam especially, is right smack in the middle of all of this. We are receivers, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. Sometimes people don't care. Sometimes people care greatly of bilateral superpower activities, operations, and the outputs of policy. And so I would just say this year, 2024, it's pivotal, and we can start with all kinds of things. But I think that I would like to, first make a disclaimer that these commentary, these talking points are, I represent myself, and I think that there's a tremendous space to further the discussion. And so I'll just start with I'll try to tie in things that people maybe that may have heard recently and tie it back into the Marianas, and I'll continue to try to do that throughout our chat with you and with the audience. Red Hill, a huge problem over in Hawaii. With it's a World War II, I believe, World War II constructed bulk fuel facility on the island of Oahu, and I believe it holds close to 300 million gallons of jet fuel. And as many of us may have heard over the past couple of years, it leaked. And the bottom of the containers basically are approximately 100 feet from the top of the aquifer, the water lens over in that part of Oahu, in that part of the world. Long story short, there was jet fuel that leaked into the main water system, into the aquifer. Got I believe several hundred, if not thousands, of people sick, or they had to check in. Both people who are there as military dependents, active duty folks, uh, villagers and residents of the beautiful state of Hawaii, and this is something that caught a tremendous amount of media attention because of its health implications, and it's an ongoing process right now. The Navy has, through the Secretary of, or not the Navy, but the Secretary of Defense has closed down the facility. They took out all the fuel and redistributed the fuel across the Pacific to various outposts where it's needed, jet fuel, such as what is in Guam, up at Anderson Air Force Base. And so they're going through litigation. Families of active duty members, local residents have sued the Navy, and they're going through litigation processes and procedures. And the takeaway is that what happened in Hawaii conceivably could happen at some point in the future in Guam if the proper steps are not taken to ensure that there are no leaks. And it would be catastrophic if Guam had experienced something like that. And what's interesting too is in Oahu, the local officials, the state officials, are worried that the fuel is already in the volcanic rock, and because it's there, they can't extract it. And because they can't extract it, the United States government, they're worried that it's going to somehow move and transit from point A to point B, closer to the other side of, closer to Waikiki, Manoa Valley, and those places. So there are many lessons to learn from the situation. One of them is that as islanders, as citizens, it's really important for us to understand and have additional discussions about the petroleum, the oil, and the lubricants, jet fuel, certainly, and how that is laid out, especially on Guam, because of the potential for future catastrophe should anything ever happen. Uh, what the military is doing is they're also building a huge fuel tank and pipeline infrastructure up in Tinian. So the cost for that's about 150 million for this year alone. And uh, I have relatives up north in Tinian, Saipan, and some of them are happy about having more money come in, certainly, and some are worried about the long-term consequences of having a fuel farm if there's a spillage. So I think that in terms of what's happening now and with what major media organizations are putting out, uh, it incentivizes all of us, whether you're Tamaru or non-Tamaru, living in Guam, living elsewhere, living in Tinian, wherever it may be, to pay for us to learn, to educate, and pay very close attention to anything associated with jet fuel, its storage, its uses, petroleum, lubricants, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I would say is maybe a first talking point, to share
Mm.
strategically, because the United States, and people will argue this. People may not like this opinion, but purely from a military standpoint only, not
Mm.
from a political status standpoint or from an environmental standpoint, the way the basin is configured throughout the Pacific Basin, most of it, as most of us know, is really concentrated in Guam to a lesser extent, but in terms of the consolidation on 210 square miles, it's very, 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 tight and consolidated, but also in Okinawa Prefecture, and certainly in the main islands of Japan, as well as the Korean Peninsula, South Korea. So, not again, that's notwithstanding the fact that there are several different layers of complexity, political issues, environmental issues, some more cultural issues, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and one of the things and I'm kind of pivoting, one of the things I'm thinking about right now too is that strategically, most of us have heard that the compacts of free association were signed a year or two ago, um, and that it allows for 20 more years of funding. The strategic challenge that the United States is facing has a direct impact on Guam, especially the Marianas, is whether or not the United States Congress is going to fully fund the monies associated with outlays every year for the next 20 years for COFA funding. If the United States does not come through, the Senate doesn't, or the Congress doesn't come through with that, we're going to have major problems. It's going to open, it would be, I would call it a strategic blunder if the funding is not made available. And that's not even discussing how much funding Guam is owed. And I believe Congressman Moylan introduced legislation that is passed that associates or that pegs some money to get to Guam, but I believe Guam's owed anywhere from $3 to $4 billion, which Congress can't pay. But the political will and the incentives for members of Congress is almost at zero for Guam to get it fully reimbursed, rightfully. So it should be fully reimbursed for a host of reasons.
Hmm. No, thank you for thank you for you bring up some issues already, and I do want to encourage those watching. Put favor, engengwa question mo, engengwa question midzu. If you have any questions or comments, put favor, let us know. Send them via Messenger, send them via WhatsApp, put them in the comments on any of these issues. We've already talked about the Red Hill fuel leak. This is something which should absolutely resonate with every Chamorro person, whether you live on an island that is covered in military bases, covered in fuel pipes that the military has built and used, or if you are a Chamorro who has been stationed on bases around the world, right? This is an issue which strikes at the core of, that should make you question and be critical of these sorts of issues. But then, as you were just talking about sort of this issue of diplomacy, COFA nations, the US, and then these Micronesian countries, I want to share a piece with you from Robert Underwood that he penned in the Pacific Island Times recently. And so he was contrasting sort of the diplomatic style of Beijing, China versus the United States around FSM engagement. And so that if you look, of course, this is FSM president, visiting China, getting the red carpet treatment, and that sort of FSM leaders were treated, given full diplomatic honors, basically treated like they were Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston. Oh, that dates me. Oh my goodness, that reference really dates me. I should have said something like Timothy Chalamet and Zendaya or something like that, or I should have made a reference like that. Dispensa. But you contrast that, as Underwood says, with the almost anticlimactic passing of the legislation of the funding for the Compact of Free Association Agreement signed last year. That Biden signed this legislation in March, which included many other items. No pomp and ceremony. Biden didn't even invite them to go get ice cream with him. And you would think that that's exactly what he would do.
Yes.
So contrast this. And so this really goes to sort of some of these issues in our region, is that China is, and China is making plays. China is sort of moving out in different ways. And the United States, good or bad, sort of seems to what is your opinion on how the United States is sort of playing its game? Because you were already kind of moving in that direction. And so that made me think about this article. So what are your thoughts on this?
Wonderful article. I need to read it, and thank you for bringing that up. My thoughts on it are prefaced by I have the highest amount of respect for Dr. and President and former Congressman Robert Underwood. Brilliant mind such as yourself, Miguel. And I would simply add that the FSM, Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, unless I'm mistaken, are currently uh, allies with Taiwan. Three different island oceanic insular entities. There are almost four times that amount of island nations that are now aligned with Beijing. So, if I understand correctly, the Honorable Dr. Underwood is saying basically that now Beijing is trying to woo in FSM. That should bring red siren lights to everybody who follows strategic matters, because anyone who looks at a map will realize that the Marianas and Guam, all the Marianas Islands are to the west, and FSM, Palau, and the Republic of the Marshalls are in between that, all the way. I guess Hawaii would be farther east, west, or northeast, but it's a huge gap that I believe covers mostly the northern portion north of the equator and then some south of the equator. Huge strategic blunder if we don't, we, the United States, and I'm saying that very generically, if we don't fully fund the Compacts of Free Association. Blunder, tremendous blunder. And it's not even relatively expensive. I believe it will cost in today's dollars approximately $7 to $7.5 billion, which is chump change when you look at how much money is being allocated in Congress for other parts of the world, such as Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, even Taiwan. So it's a huge blunder. The consequences of not funding that are that it could potentially, and as we see with Dr. Underwood's article, it's going to incentivize these island leaders to then try to partner with Beijing, because Beijing wants to have as much influence in our general part of the world as the United States does. And it's interesting because as a follow on, the U.S. has recently, and pardon me for I'm flipping around, I wrote some notes here, but they recently have gotten involved with um, getting into agreements with Papua New Guinea and with the Cook Islands, and there are a couple of other Tonga and the Solomons. And the Solomons are disputed now because China is making several kinds of inroads. Uh, the strategic takeaway, or one of the strategic lessons, Professor, is that this whole huge expanse of ocean that is our blue continent is being pursued very, I mean, in some respects, not so aggressively, in other respects, very aggressively. Uh, China, though, is in it for a longer game, it seems, based on how they reportedly think. So they view things out 100 years, as opposed to the West, if you will, which view things in increments of 4, 8, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. So it's tremendously consequential for people from any village and any island of the Marianas, and certainly in Micronesia. Absolutely. So I hope that gives some additional insights, because it's really, really important. And it's realpolitik. You know, it's two of one of the most powerful countries in the world, certainly the United States and China. So it is it's quite something.
Oh, sedus masi. And you mentioned Papua New Guinea, and I think many people on islands sort of missed it. But even it was fascinating because while Biden and excuse me, the United States and China are both sort of competing for Papua New Guinea's attention. Uh, President Biden was making speeches on the campaign trail in which he talked about how one of his uncles was eaten by cannibals in Papua New Guinea during World War II.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so it was one of those sort of moments where you can see that, that perhaps, it's just kind of like you have to wonder if the United States, in terms of what their approach is, if they do have an imperial plan.
Well, what's very interesting, you bring up some very good points. What's interesting is the Biden administration, and I'm not saying this as a Democrat or as a Republican. From the United States standpoint, they actually held the first, it was called the Pacific Islands Forum about 2 years ago when we were still in the COVID. And they went through all these public pronouncements about giving additional monies, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting though, because Joe Biden was actually the first guy to come up with the idea and to actually execute on it. And then the follow through is, well, what does that really mean? And how are we to interpret it from a, geopolitical, geomilitary, geoeconomic standpoint? And you're absolutely right. These little islands that may not be important in other times of history now are very important to both the United States and China. And you know the interesting thing is that if we to follow the money, if we follow the money, Professor, and we say where is the United States really talking, the answer is purely in military terms. Uh, for example, and I'll give a broad statement and then I'll bring it in directly to the villages. Over the next 60 months, the United States is planning in dollars as of now, including inflation as of now, approximately $40 billion outlays. If we took $4 billion of that 40 billion, we could pay off everything that Guam is rightfully due through due through COFA, pay it right off. And this is over the next 5 years. So uh, it's a tremendous amount of money that's going to be spent. Now, alone just on Guam, everybody knows of the THAAD, right? The what is it? Terminal High Altitude Air Defense structure. That alone is there is almost $500 million going into construction this year alone for sites on Guam that relate to Guam defense. It's called Defense of Guam Architecture. Uh, the United States has identified approximately 20 sites on island that they want to use for different pieces of this Guam defense architecture. And uh, it's very interesting because it's a tremendous amount of money. I mean, it's just so much money. And it relates to radars that are transportable, that are used by both the Army and the Navy. Uh, I believe that the military wants to settle on 3 permanent sites, though, for this this architecture, this system. And what's also interesting is that a lot of the local boys are working. They work as Army, active duty Army. The battery in Guam is considered probably the most important battery for a THAAD organization, as well as the one in South Korea. The rest are back in the continental U.S., but these are very, very important and consequential attempts by the United States to provide some kind of defense. It's not perfect, but the takeaway for the listeners and for us in terms of education and to understand is that THAAD is part of a broader defense network in Guam. We currently have, or the Department of Defense wants to put in an Aegis-based shore-based facility, which is a radar. They put it on Navy surface vessels. So remember, Maget, back I think it was 2013 when Kim Jong-un was threatening Guam. They interviewed you, and you were saying, "Oh yeah, this is typical," about being threatened by DPRK.
Uh-huh. Mm.
And I don't know if you remember, Senor, but they were saying that they had Navy ships, and these radars are on Navy ships. They go in circle eights
Mm.
offshore of the Marianas, right?
Yeah.
Offshore of Guam.
Okay.
So one thing that's really instructive for us to know is as residents, as islanders, as citizens, is what is going on the ships. The command and control, the sensor networks are not connected necessarily and tied to one overarching architecture for the THAAD. So the point is the Navy's doing one thing in the ocean, The Army guys are doing one thing on land, and now the THAAD is going over to the Vicente Blas camp, Camp Blas. It's been repositioned for uh, there are logical reasons for that for incoming missiles, but so uh, it's really important for us to know that what the Pentagon is trying to do, I would say, is actually purely the military standpoint, nothing more. It's logical in the sense that they want to have a multi-layered, all-domain defense for the resources they have to fight a potential war with China. Now, the huge gap that's created, Professor, is this, and this is what Ginger Cruz and Congressman Moylan, I hope Moylan works on this, and if Ginger wins, I hope Ginger works on this, is that what this is called, sir, this is called active defense, as opposed to passive defense. Now, passive defense is a term that's used in the military community when they talk about, for example, up in Zigu, the hardening of these aircraft hangars, the hardening of buildings, the protection and hardening of petroleum, oil, and lubricant facilities, the hardening of bunkers that house ammo. And we have a tremendous amount of ammo and fuel on Guam, tremendous amount. So much so that if it was publicly released, it'd probably make everyone uh, jump out of their pants and be that scared. Yeah, there's so much on island. Um, but here's where Ginger and Jim have not, I haven't heard anything on the social media side or on any television reports. How about the passive defense for the protection of all the Timors and all the villagers of the island of Guam? In other words, a nuclear bomb shelter, some kind of infrastructure, at least that can at least be authorized in congressional language that says we need to get this kind of protection, passive protection for the residents of Guam, the islanders of Guam, and by extension, those who live in Tinian and Saipan, et cetera, et cetera. Luta, or not Luta, but Tinian and Saipan. So, yeah, this idea of defense is considered in military language. It's called active defense, and then passive defense is when they put the hundreds of millions of dollars into, what they're doing right now. They're attempting to defend the island against ballistic missile attacks, hypersonic missile attacks, and cruise missile attacks. Cruise missiles are lower, they go lower. The stuff that shoots out farther goes higher and comes down faster. I'm not sure we are fully prepared for hypersonic. We are less than 3,000 miles away from Beijing, from North Korea, from all the land-based areas where they can fire weapons or fire missiles. We do not know where their sea-launched, the positions are. The key point to take away, Maget, is that Guam is very, very vulnerable. We're within that medium range. We're not long range as if it were to be Washington State or Washington D.C. No, we are medium range. We're right there. And as you may recall, there's a missile called the DF Delta Fox DF dash or TAC 21, and they call that the Guam killer. So yeah, Guam is unique in many ways. Much of it is, unfortunately, much of it is very, very dangerous because of our location, and hopefully we will never ever have to go into a hot war. Um,
Mm,
but the Army is involved with that in the what they call the Missile Defense Agency. It's referred to as the
mm.
MDA, and yeah, Guam is just the Army's doing a lot of things. And I can go on and on about that because I took a bunch of
No,
notes.
no, no.
We have
But thank you for reminding us though about sort of because it's common for your average person to simply say the military, right? But then and think that oh the military would protect us or the military will help us, forgetting of course that there's different parts to the military, there's different branches of service, but then those branches operate on different systems. And so if Guam was attacked, do those systems communicate with each other? would they be able to coordinate to help Guam and protect Guam, right? And I think that's what I've seen. Uh, for example, Robert Underwood and Dr. Ken Gofigan Cooper and Leland Bettis and their group, the Pacific Center for Island Security, one of the things that they've been critical of in terms of like the missile defense is that it's one of those things that's just not ready. You know, that there's a I think Gifinotnesi Robert Underwood, he said it's not ready for prime time. You
Okay.
know, it's that there's still and so are you familiar with sort of some of those issues? Can you speak to that?
Yes, I can actually. I will say that Dr. Underwood, again, someone who I have the highest admiration for, is absolutely correct. By, for example, by 2027, and this could be pushed out back to 2028, 2029, 2030, uh, there is supposed to be an on-island command center that is is solely for the Joint Missile Defense System to defend the island. We don't know if that will happen. Some people refer to it also as a defense of Guam architecture, where we have radar, as well as they call it see, vertical launching sites, I think, VLS. Uh, and the Navy is trying to put, I believe, through the Missile Defense Agency, the Aegis shore-based architecture that is currently on surface vessels in the United States Navy. Uh, and you're right, and Dr. Underwood is correct. It is not ready for prime time. This year alone, Professor, they're putting in $1 billion into Guam on this one particular matter. Approximately $1 billion. Actually, technically, it's like $1.2 billion. So, um, yeah, it's quite something. And I think over the next year, Guam alone is going to see close to $2 billion total for missile defense alone. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and the Navy is putting up, I mean, there's a Joint Intelligence Operations Center. Uh, just this year alone, just the Navy alone is spending over $1 billion. $1 billion. That's one quarter of the money that could go to COFA to pay off Guam, the government of Guam, for rightfully for what it's owed. Is going into a not a joint intelligence center, but an operating force. It's classified programs. Just the Navy alone.
Mm.
But I'll tie it back to your point because you brought up that the military. I would say that the way we should view the military as an educational opportunity for those who may not be familiar is it's important to realize that the Navy, the Marine Corps are under the same house. It's called the Department of the Navy. The Air Force has its own thing. The Army has its own thing. The Coast Guard has its own thing, but the Coast Guard is not under the Department of Defense. It's under the Department of Homeland Security. And so when Congress, approves all this money and then it gets distributed to the military departments for spending for operations and planning and all this stuff, missile defense, each of the services go about it their own way. And there is a lot of cross channel communications, but they each have their own ways of doing things. And that has a tremendous consequence on the island because, I mean, the way things are amplified in Guam, if the Navy is doing something with weapons, the Air Force might be doing something somewhat similar, but they're doing it their own way. Um, as is the Army. The Army has a lot going on in Guam that people most likely don't hear about as often, and it's just it's quite something. And I'll give you another example if you don't mind about like with the Army. Uh, they're doing a hypervelocity gun weapon systems program. They're working closely with Japan's self-defense forces. The and to go strategically, the Air Force, for example, they're planning on bringing on a permanent rotational basis, as the Air Force does now with the bombers that come out of the continental U.S., a a permanently rotational Air Force that's coming out of the Singapore military, and that's going to be put in place in about 4 years. So the point is that each of the branches do their own thing, and they're getting billions of dollars over the next 60 months to take care of stuff that's still in the process. Um, if I could switch to the Marine Corps, I'd like to share something with you too.
Oh yeah, por favor, por favor.
The Marine Corps, the Marine Corps is bringing in, of course, we know what happened in Okinawa and at Futenma and the rape of the 12-year-old girl. And the Marine Corps is actually going to, they have the 4th Marines there. It's a numbered Marine regiment. They call it in the Marine Corps language and terminology. They're going to actually convert this into the 4th Marine Littoral Regiment. Now, what's the big deal about that? The big deal is the Marines are going through this organization-wide change that was previously called Force 2030 or Joint Force or Force Design 2030. What does it mean? What it means is that the Marines are getting rid of some older programs, they're getting rid of large weapons, heavier weapons, and they want to be more like a special operations reconnaissance organization, distributed with fewer numbers of people, being able to neutralize Chinese aircraft, ships, assets that could potentially be used for war against Taiwan and or the United States or the Philippines in that case, if something were to happen. Um, the Marine Corps alone, I think for this year is going to be spending, I wrote it down here, just tremendous amounts of money. Um, yeah, with Camp Bloss, for example, they're putting in a Marine Infantry Regiment, basically a bunch of guys coming in for infantry, logistics battalion, a combat logistics battalion, an aircraft combat element they call ACE, a command element, which means probably a general will be in charge of that for the Marine Expeditionary Brigade, and as well as a THAAD will be placed at Camp Bloss. That's where it is. And so, in terms of money, I'm just trying to see if I have any numbers on my notes that I took. I don't have a figure for that, but I do know that the Marines are also they do have their own separate, or will have their own separate water supply. So they'll be tapping into the water lens, but they'll keep a separate minimum baseline supply, separate and distinct from the rest of the island. In Sumai, the Navy is doing the same thing with the electrical grid. So they're going to be having I don't know if it's over a roti, but they're going to be having a separate additional power grid in case the island grid doesn't just completely fails. That's what they're doing, and yeah, so it is. There's so much going on. Again, there's so much going
No,
on.
Sidus Masi, it's thank you for thank you for talking about these things and for bringing these things to our attention, because I think a lot of people, you live on this island, and in some ways we might be too close to it, right? And so I think for a lot of people, the idea sort of that the dollar sign of the military just stands in for all this stuff. People say, oh, well, we need the military to survive. And then the brain shuts off after that. The thinking shuts off after that. You just think, well, that's it. That's the end of the conversation. But in truth, that should really be the start of a conversation. If that's where you begin, we need the military to survive. It's kind of like, that's that's not good. That's not a good place to be in. Whoa. Is that true, first of all? Is it true that our economy is really that dependent? And if so, man, we got to change that. We got to do something different. How are we dependent? What can we do differently? And you had mentioned at the beginning about the Red Hill fuel leak. And this is one thing that there were some protests that happened on Guam. There are some activists here that are very passionate about this. But I was very disappointed that fewer people here knew about it or even cared about it. I know that in Oahu it was quite big. And so let me just play a clip from Hawaii News, just because I know it's been ongoing. There's a trial that's going on now over the issue there. And so talk about it, and then hold on one second. Here we go.
Sure, take your time.
Dozens of people came out to Pearl Harbor for a day of reflection over last year's Red Hill fuel leak. The Board of Water Supply, affected residents, and local organizations were among those in attendance, asking for more transparency from military officials. Bryce Moore has the story.
We cannot live without precious, pure water.
The chief engineer of the Honolulu Board of Water Supply says in his more than 4 decades of public service, he never imagined fighting for clean drinking water.
And I'll just tell you, when I first started 43 years ago, I never imagined we would be in this situation. But I'm also very proud that there are members from the community and different organizations here that are standing with us, all of us together.
Wait.
Hey.
Afa, mangi internet. Ay, de hunggan. What? Safa Pumara. But if it doesn't continue, then sort of the goal, because I was reminded of this because you had just mentioned the issue of sort of the
Most important issue.
Oh, hold on.
Rebecca Garrison with Hawaii Peace and Justice says she went through 10 lies allegedly told by the military. Number one being,
Secretary of the Navy Carlos Del Toro said that fuel wasn't making people sick. It was the fuel in the water that was making people sick. No, water is life. Fuel is poison.
folks in attendance want quicker action to defuel the tanks, provide assistance to impacted families, and more transparency. One affected Pearl City Peninsula resident says her community is still in need of bottled water.
And we do things the island way. Please include our Kanaka Maoli, our native Hawaiian, and our born and raised locals to your seat as a joint task force Red Hill.
As far as a message to regulators and the Navy, the Board of Water Supply says the people have spoken.
You can see the commitment and the love that these people have for this, for our community and for this precious vi. So open up and be transparent and allow the community to be a part of this process.
The Red Hill Joint Task Force said in parts through a statement, in coordination with the Department of Health and as specified in their conditional approval letter, we are actively taking additional measures to prevent or respond to a spill. We are going about this deliberately and methodically, but also as expeditiously as possible. Bryce Moore, KHON2 News.
Wow.
And so I was reminded of, because you had mentioned Red Hill at the beginning, and I was reminded of it again because you talked about how this is something that always strikes me, is that the military, talks about sort of cooperation, one Guam, working together. But then, as you mentioned, sort of developing their own separate utilities, their own water supply, sort of, making their own contingency plans in that way, sort of it's an interesting sort of reminder that regardless of the gestures that are made, what is it that they say that words said at night at midnight are worthless at the dawn. And so what the military says in one moment, who knows what it's worth the next. And so this issue of clean water on an island, right? And this is so important because if you live on a big, huge continent, maybe you can not care about water in the same way because you can truck it in from somewhere else. But if you live on small islands, water is limited. Water is even more precious. And so even just that issue there, the military lack of transparency, poisoning some of their own service people. It was reminiscent even of somebody such as Angel Santos, who was radicalized by his own children suffering because of ingesting contaminated drinking water while being stationed on Andersen Air Force Base, being something that caused him to become radicalized while he was in the Air Force, while he was an airman. And so speak about, I wanted to give you another chance to talk about Red Hill, to talk about these issues of transparency, to talk about the issue, the relationship to the military, and to talk about this precious resource that we need to survive.
Sure. I'll preface it by talking a little bit more on Red Hill and then going immediately to the most important island, which is Guam. Uh, there were some misconduct, negligent officers in the Navy under, I believe it was Naval Facilities and Engineering, who dropped the ball in whatever ways and shapes they did that enabled this problem to go on. They just were not doing what they were supposed to do, being paid to do. And I hope to God that it was not purposefully ignored, but it was a huge spill. And it just caused so many people, thousands of people, to get some kind of sickness. And what's interesting, and then I'll pivot to Guam, what's interesting though is that while the island of Oahu is trying to figure out what to do about this catastrophe, this fresh water, at the very same time, and I think Michael Sinikolas might have been in office when this was happening, there's over a $20 billion effort to reconstitute all of the public American national military shipyards. So the point is this: millions, if not billions, will need to go to fixing Red Hill. Thousands will get sick and contaminated, possibly in the future. Litigation is ongoing. And simultaneously, if you go down to Joint Base Pearl Harbor, they're building the single largest project on record in the United States Navy for shipyards. It's about a $3.5 billion transaction to modernize, expand, repile all of the areas there to house and maintain these incredible submarines called Virginia-class submarines. They're more recent than Los Angeles-class submarines. And so let me pivot now to Guam, and I'm going to talk about what I think resident citizens, doesn't matter who you are, it's important as a human as a human right, is something we all need. It's incredibly important that we take care of the water, especially in Tinian. I would offer up 2 points unsolicited to Congressman Moylan, to Ginger Cruz, and to anyone else running for office. In the position of Guam delegate, there is nothing that can prevent the introduction and establishment for the authorization of EPA to take a look at its regs for freshwater resources on military installations, and to revisit and perhaps update and expand the regulatory framework of the EPA, where the EPA will then be forced by law to create new provisions that will enhance and protect future water supplies. I'm just thinking of Camp Pendleton, or not Camp Pendleton, but Camp Lejeune over in the East Coast in the Mid-Atlantic, where thousands of Marines got sick because of negligence by senior and general officers who knew that there was a problem with fuel and contamination and chemicals, and did nothing or did little in the way of trying to resolve the situation. So the EPA route to introduce authorization language is one route. A second route, which has never even been conceived of publicly, is this: the Guam delegate, whether it's Jimmy or Ginger Crundon Cruz, introduce legislation, authorization language, requiring that military officers who are, for example, involved in, like, the Joint Region Marianas. He's basically the mayor of Guam for the military, on the military side, or he's kind of like a landlord. Require that for them to get promoted to 1-star, 2-star vice admiral, that they are going to have to meet certain environmental training iterations and be graded on, and to have them promoted to the next level based on how they care for the environment. But all this is beyond the military. It's about legislation. And that's where folks like, whether it's going to be Jimmy or Ginger or Amanda, or whoever else is going to run, can actually help Guam, the United States Admiralty, and the General Officer Corps of the United States Air Force, because Air Force has a huge presence over our aquifers, as we all know too well. So I think those are two specific unsolicited suggestions that can actually help, fellow citizens, residents, and it doesn't matter if you're military or not, it's going to help everybody, because if we have one huge major catastrophe from something that breaks, my mom says, "Susmarose," right? It's going to go down the tubes. Yeah, so, and I really think it's really important for us to focus on that. And here's a second specific unsolicited suggestion I have for thinking about for both Ginger, Amanda, whoever else is running for Jimmy. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of rounds of all calibers are going to be shot into the ocean, past the reef. Northern part of Guam, northwestern part of Guam. There's no authorization language. There's nothing, there's no program or record to clean that up. Nothing. If our military is going to be discharging rounds, thousands upon thousands of rounds into open waters several times a week, day in and day out, why is there not the establishment to using authorization language to introduce a study and design to begin to figure out how to mitigate the environmental damage that will take place close in? It has never been done. So 3 specific suggestions to both Jimmy and to Ginger and anyone else running for office.
No,
and
see.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, please, I'm sorry.
Oh, no, por favor, go ahead.
And I was going to say, you mentioned like a lot of times discussions are shut down when we talk about military spending. You said that should actually be the starting point. Professor, you were exactly right. It should be the starting point, because very few people, whether you're in Maine, Guam, Hawaii, Washington State, understand the defense budget. This year alone, the amounts of money spent in the general region for presence and posturing of operating forces is close to $7 billion. Money used for training, like Valiant, Shield, Balik, the Tagalog word, I can't even pronounce it. The one that takes place yearly. For training, experimentation, and exercises, the United States is spending approximately $2 billion for this specific region of the world. Infrastructure improvements, slightly less than $2 billion for this region of the world. Defense security capabilities of allies and partners, not territories, but allies and partners. Close to $1 billion FY25 money. And it goes on and on and on. And so I think that your point, Michael, about having the conversation start there is where it should actually begin. Because for every dollar, again, the next 60 months, we're going to see 40 billion appropriated dollars go to this region of the world. And if the Congress had the political will, they don't have the incentive, but if they had the political will, without the DOI involved, the DOI, in my opinion, is a complete waste of time. If the Congress just wrote a check directly to the government of Guam for $4 billion, call it a day, because that's what's needed to be able to reconcile the books. But we don't have the political capital, and we don't have the political advantage as other elements of or segments of society has. We just don't have the political power, if you will, in terms of the Pacific being represented. And I'll say this and then I'll be quiet because I know we're getting close to time. But what's interesting is the Congress in general, typically, because of the political atmosphere and the donating, the political action committee infrastructure and ecosystem, because it's still so focused on the European theater, on the Middle East, on Israel, on Iran, and all these other places, a lot of times the output from the political action committees reflects how powerful they are by how much Congress appropriates. So, for example, and I'm going to tie it back to Guam. For example, Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan got close to $100 billion recently approved by the United States Congress. A lot of infighting in the Senate, but the Congress pumped that money out. Congress historically has not demonstrated evidence in the congressional record that they care even an inch about the Pacific outside of the basing structures and outside of the operating structures of the Department of Defense, because we get relatively very little money. Gov Guam is a perfect case in point. Look at Kwajalein from the Bikini Island thing. They get very little money in relation to what they had to endure from the testing and stuff. But the point being is that because we lack political power in the Congress, that translates into getting very little in terms of bringing home the bacon, if you will. And it makes it even especially more difficult when we try to get things like full reimbursements for COFA, infrastructure money outside of grants that have to be applied for. It just makes it very difficult.
No, Sidus Masi. It is an important reminder, Hungan. It's an important reminder that even if when we in the Marianas look at the United States might be the center of our universe, but we are nowhere near the center of the universe for the United States. And so we should not expect to be. Whatever sort of we receive, we have to sort of push for. We may have to lobby for. We may have to fight for. It may require more than simply sort of so you may need sort of a very skilled taladzero to cast the perfect net. But I want to give you Sidus Masi, Rick, Sidus Masi, Senor Preste, I want to give you a chance, though, to share some final thoughts. We've been talking on a number of different issues. And I'm thinking, of course, that, bringing you back every few months as you said, this is a dynamic part of the world. We've got Taiwan, China, North Korea, we have the FSM, and we've got all of these moving parts. And so can definitely bring you back, but I want to give you a chance now to share some closing thoughts before we go.
Sure, thank you. I would like to preface the closing thoughts, Dr. Bivako, with saying to this Masile, for everything that you've done, for the invitation to reappear and to speak to to the public through your program. I want to also thank you for all the work you've done, both at the University of Guam and at the Guam Museum. You're a trailblazer. I think in 75 years from now, people will be talking about all the work that you are doing now, 75 years out. So I want to thank you for your leadership intellectually and practically. My final comments are really simple. They're strategic military focused. They're intended to educate for further discussion and debate in the public square. Guam, as an island, it holds three main bases: Camp Bloss, Sumai, Navy base, and then Anderson. It is an integral part of the American national security infrastructure in the Asia-Pacific area. It is so crucial that when compared to South Korea has 7 main bases. Guam has 3 main bases. We call these in the military enduring bases. Japan has approximately 14 when you include Okinawa Prefecture. Enduring bases. Wake, Kwajalein, and Diego Garcia in Singapore are also in that boat. The final thought I want to put out is with the election of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., I believe that's his name. I'm not sure if that's his name, the one who preceded Duterte. the United States has renewed its enhanced defense cooperation agreement. Why do I mention that? It's key to know that the results of the discussions between the United States and the Republic of the Philippines is now allowing U.S. forces to go from 4 to 9 different locations to be used in the country to prepare for a variety of contingencies in the South China Sea. And the South China Sea we can talk about at another time. The key point is this, though. The Philippine infrastructure for defense of the United States and its interests are based on rotational movement of troops in, troops out, troops in, troops out. And one of the reasons, in addition to what we see in the media where China is provoking Taiwan, or there's always this skirmish between wanting to fully incorporate Taiwan back into China and Taiwan pushing back, saying, no, you're not going to do that, is that it's not just the fact that it's a large populous part of the planet. It's not just the fact that it's an epicenter of a world economy. It's that about over $3 trillion worth of sea-based goods come through the Taiwan Strait alone. The South China Sea, which is less than 2,000 miles from Guam in the Marianas, has over 3 trillion cubic feet of natural gas subsurface. The South China Sea also holds billions and billions of barrels of crude. So in addition to what we read about in the media about, either the United States posturing or China posturing, what we're talking about is we're talking about tremendous amounts of untapped natural resources before we even get into seafloor nuggets of magnesium, manganese, et cetera, which is more closer to the Central Pacific, farther away from Guam, east of Eastern Micronesia and Kwajalein. So those would be my parting points, is that the infrastructure makes a lot of sense from a military standpoint. It's actually quite impressive. But the big difference is that unlike Japan, South Korea, Guam, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Palau, Singapore, Diego Garcia, the Philippine system and structure is based on rotational forces, and that can change at any time. And the U.S. is on the hook. If something goes down big beyond water guns, where the Chinese Coast Guard are spraying water guns against the Philippine Coast Guard, beyond that, if something goes really down, we're going to end up with 2 scenarios. And this is my final point to the final point. Either we're going to have some kind of submarine clash in the Strait of Taiwan, or we're going to have to somehow come to the aid of the Taiwanese if the Chinese armies start to invade and actually hold positions in Taiwan. And that, sir, is going to require the immediate and direct response of both strategic aircraft based out of Guam, the submarines, the LA-class submarines. And by the way, we will get Virginia-class submarines in Guam based on what they're doing in Hawaii. That's what I predict. And Marine units are going to have to be dispersed and fully or additionally supported through various channels, including being a repositioning point for logistical supplies further west into the Philippine archipelago. So those would be my final points. And next time we talk, I'll be happy to get deep. We can even talk about the Marine Corps, for example, which has a tremendous, it's going through tremendous change. And it's to the benefit and education of our citizens and our residents to be fully aware of what General Berger, well, he retired, but General Smith, he's the top guy, is thinking these days about Guam and Pacific.
No, si Zeus Masi. No, si Zeus Masi. Zahwesti y compensashonta. I've enjoyed this conversation very much. Si Zeus Masi, senor Nai. Put ifinatok mo gwini za si Zeus Masi no hamzu todos. Put ine kungok pat ine ega. Esti finakpo esti na episode Fanachu. Adios. Este ki manat lead hamzu. Este ki manat lead